this conversation. I'll keep it brief as much as possible, but give you some, sort of big picture thinking on what is the economic vision for India that has evolved over the last few years. So if we think about the economic vision for India, think about that as a tripod or a triangle. If you think about it as a tripod, let's talk about the three legs that actually really put flesh into this vision for India. Or if you think about a triangle, the three vertices that basically incorporate that jivatma into the triangle. The first leg is, so I'll just mention them first and then explain, a little bit more, sort of give more color to it. First leg is the exclusive focus on growth together with efficient welfare. So growth plus efficient welfare is the first leg. The second leg is something that Gopal already talked about ethical wealth creation as the second leg. To pursue growth, how to go about getting growth is ethical wealth creation, so that growth can happen in a sustained manner. That's the second leg or the second vertex. And the third is by far the most granular, or sort of where the tire hits the road, which is a virtuous cycle starting from private investment itself leading to productivity improvements and jobs, that putting consumption, putting money in the hands of people, enhancing consumption, and that consumption then actually furthering investment and reforms, structural reforms, especially on the supply side, and capital expenditure by the fisc, being the triggers for this virtuous cycle, either starting that virtuous cycle or accelerating it. So that's sort of the tripod, in terms of the economic vision for India. Let me explain a little bit on, I think the first objective is, first leg is extremely important, because policy making, I think maybe this is obvious, but I must still emphasize, clarity of objective is by far the most important. Whether it's about a household's policy, an individual's policy, a company's policy, or a country's policy, what is the objective that one is pursuing? I think clarity on that is extremely important, because inevitably, especially at the level of a country, and on the macroeconomic side, there are inevitable trade-offs, and because there are trade-offs, how to resolve those trade-offs, which side to balance on, I think is extremely important. And in that perspective, I would emphasize that growth together with welfare actually, and them being sort of, in some sense, again, two hands that clap together, or the hand of growth marrying with the hand of efficient welfare. That's another way of thinking about it, but not actually, they are separate separate individuals coming together, but at the same time maintaining their individual identities. I think that is important. If we try to do welfare, in growth, or if you try to do growth in welfare, I think that will actually lead to confusion. And I think this separation, at the same time, complementarity is extremely important. For instance, I think there can't be a better year to illustrate the importance of growth. There is always this debate between growth versus inequality, and research in the advanced economies is shaping a lot of opinion, and I use that word very carefully instead of actually careful research in the emerging economies like India. This year's economic survey, we showed it very clearly. So a lot of people make the mistake of just drawing what happens in the advanced economies and just cut pasting it in India, but now forgetting that the state of, or the stage of development can be very different. So related to that, what we must be doing is think from first principles, think from ab initio about what is it that is appropriate for us, actually not peddle opinion, especially when it comes to macroeconomics, cut pasting from advanced economies. As we showed in the economic survey, unlike in the advanced economies where there is this tension between inequality and growth, possibly because of the much more advanced stage of development they are in, and possibly because they don't have as much absolute poverty, there is this tension, conflict. But in the Indian context, there is no conflict, it's actually convergence. And almost 85% of reduction in poverty comes from growth, because growth generates those resources to be able to actually do efficient welfare. I think that, clarity is extremely important. So this exclusive focus on growth and using those resources to do efficient welfare is the first aspect, first objective that we have to have. Second, which is wealth creation, ethical wealth creation especially. And here, what I have been amazed at, when we started doing the research for the last year's economic survey and went and read a lot of native literature, instead, first piece of work that I went through very carefully was Angus Madison's research. Angus Madison, very painstakingly has documented what has been the contribution to world's GDP from 180 till 2080. And I think it was an aha moment for me, and which I hope I can share with you. Up until 1750 AD, this is just before, the 7-Day War, imperialism in India. Up until 1750 AD, India consistently contributed at least 33% of world's GDP, at least 33% of world's GDP. In other words, 17 and a half centuries contributing at least 33%. And this is not some basically flight of fancy saying, oh, Sone ki chidiya, just a sort of poetic, which I have respect for, actually, that came from the reality. But this is actual empirical evidence showing that up until 1750 AD, India accounted for at least 33% of world's GDP. Now, to get a sense of how much of dominance this is, let's just take the country that we know as the economic superpower, the United States, and put the same facts for the United States together. At its best, the United States has accounted for about 16-17% of world's GDP. So maximum about 17% of world's GDP, which is half of. So in India, India at least 33%, many times close 40%, even more than 40%. And at best, US has had 15-16%. In recent times, it has come down to 12-13%. So that's the first fact in terms of just the, how much of the contribution to world GDP. And then think about the duration. The United States has been an economic superpower for half a century. India had this kind of dominance for 17 and a half centuries. Just put it together and just how mind-boggling it is. Half a century versus 17 and a half centuries, maximum of 15-16% versus at least 33%. And then ask the question that such kind of dominance does not come by sheer luck. It comes because of the quality of the economic model that led to that kind of dominance. Actually, first let it sink in, the dominance, and then reflect on the why of that dominance. And I think that's where, that's what led to me. Actually, I remember my father, mentioning about Thirukural, about, you used to make me read the Bhagavad Gita oftentimes. But, when I read the Thirukural, actually, and, Saint Thiruvalluvar talks about wealth creation, among the, as we all know, the Porulpal, Agattapal, Kamattapal, in Porulpal, he talks about about wealth and ethical wealth creation. And it was, that's when I realized that literature is whatever is written in the, what is in the printed word. It is not just what is written in English. I think that is something we have to actually acknowledge, and anything that actually is part of, even if it's 3,500 years back, but the ideas, the profoundness of those ideas just is something that we have to admire and therefore respect as well. So the reason India had that kind of dominance is because of the ideas of ethical wealth creation, the marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of ethics. And that hand of ethics itself came from our moral, spiritual, Vedantic, heritage, which basically is what led to say, ethical wealth creation. For instance, and a couple of very simple ideas that all of us hear on a very frequent basis in India is, if you think about the four noble pursuits, dharma, arth, kama, moksha, and arth is wealth, and that is something which And when at the end of a religious function, when asirvadams are given, they're actually material prosperity is also given as an asirvadam. And so there's in India, in our DNA, I think artha and actually wealth as a boon has always existed, not as a bane, not as a dirty word, which is how actually the first prime minister of this country did a lot of good things. But when the word profit was mentioned, don't ever mention this word ever again, because it's a dirty word. That's not what our heritage is. We write in the north, for instance, shubh labh are written together. Shubh is good, shubham, and labh, profit. Actually, nobody ever says basically shubh and hani, or ashubh and labh. We say shubh and labh. That is what actually the heritage is. So if you think about ethical wealth creation as a second pillar, the second leg of this tripod, that is just India going back to its DNA, and abandoning the ephemeral tryst, quote unquote, tryst with socialism that never delivered, the tryst with destiny, and that is what the second leg is all about. And that I call it ephemeral because in a history of millennia, a few decades is but ephemeral, and we have to acknowledge that. The third leg, and which just builds on the second one, is this virtuous cycle starting from private investment. In the 2018-19 economic survey, in trying to create a strategy for India to become a 5 trillion economy, the first thing we did was we looked at countries over the last century, full century, countries that grew at least 5% in real terms, and for at least a decade. So these were the two filters. In other words, not ephemeral growth, 5% plus growth for at least a decade. And then the filter of countries that we got in that, we then went and looked at what is that trigger, because at the macroeconomic level, every variable is both a cause and an effect. Investment is the cause of growth, but investment is also the effect of anticipated greater consumption. Consumption is the cause of growth, but consumption is also consumption is the effect of growth, but also the cause of investment, and so on. Jobs actually are the effect of growth, but at the same time, jobs are the cause of consumption as well. At the macroeconomic level, every variable is a cause and an effect, and therefore, which is the chicken, which is the egg? It requires scholarly work to be able to go and find out what is the trigger of that virtuous cycle, and that's what we actually showed, that it starts from private investment. The virtuous cycle gets triggered through private investment. Private investment actually leads to productivity improvements, creates jobs in the economy, and that's when, and the details actually I'm not going into, they're all there in the first chapter of the 2018-19 economic survey, but it's that virtuous cycle that India has to pursue to create sustained growth, 8% plus in real terms. That's what India has to follow. And here, the role of public capital expenditure is important, because public capex crowds in private investment, and also structural reforms, especially on the supply side, because supply side reforms, without that, if you have aggregate demand increasing without aggregate supply increasing, then you will have inflation. And that's just, I think, Econ 101, something that we learn, undergraduate students learn first thing, demand and supply. If you have only demand increasing without supply changing, quantity will go up, but price will go up as well. But therefore, at the macroeconomic level, you have to actually, when you increase aggregate demand, you have to increase aggregate supply as well, so that the impact on GDP growth is sustainable. At the same time, it comes without inflation. So these are the three key legs of basically the vision for economic development in India. Now let me come to Gopal's specific question on savings, investment, and it actually relates to this virtuous cycle. One of the things that, and there are two key arguments that I want to actually throw light on. One, oftentimes we hear about this phenomenon, or this phrase called crowding out versus crowding in. And what you hear is that when you have, if suppose public investment goes up, if the fisc basically borrows more to invest, it's likely that, or the fisc borrows more, without saying whether it's for investment or for revenue expenditure. The argument is, if fisc it takes out more, then the private investment gets crowded out. That's the argument that is given. In contrast, in this year's economic survey, the first chapter, and in the 2018-19 economic survey first chapter, we've shown how savings are actually pro-cyclical. And this here it's important to understand the entire crowding out argument assumes the pool of loanable funds to be static. Now, if the pool of loanable funds remains static, does not increase, then when you actually have, if the public sector takes out 1 rupee more, there's 1 rupee less left for the private sector. That's a crowding out argument. But if your pool of loanable funds increases, and that happens when the virtuous cycle proceeds, savings are pro-cyclical with the economy, and there's a lot of research that's been shown that savings responds even more, since the elasticity is even higher, to growth of, elasticity of savings to growth is even higher than that of investment. And if that happens, then the pool of loanable funds expands. When you have pool of loanable funds expanding, the public sector taking out 1 rupee more, which helps that pool of loanable funds to grow, to increase through capital expenditure, then you can actually have even private sector still taking out more, especially when the public sector takes that additional rupee to invest in infrastructure, because infrastructure crowds in private investment. So this is really important to understand. So, a lot of even some of the commentary that I'm seeing now is based on this assumption that your savings pool is finite or is basically static. I think that is something which is very important to to see what are the assumptions that are being made in putting out these economic arguments. In a macro economy, not only is it the case that, as I said, every variable is a cause and an effect, but dynamically across time, things are not static. These are not in equilibria. They actually they are growing. I think that's important to understand. So, in simple terms, what I want to mention, Gopal, is that as growth picks up, savings will increase, and that is the second point. Is the reason savings actually might have been impacted, especially risky savings in the last 1 year, is because there's always flight to safety when uncertainty is high, and moving away from deposits to for deposits which are much safer instruments, let's say, to for instance, let's say investing in stock markets or other risky investments, because households will always move towards safe assets when uncertainty in the economy is very high. And that is what happened, at the onset of the pandemic. The first 5-6 months, uncertainty was very high. So I think we have to be very careful to not be victims of saliency bias, which is that we just take the last observation, last few, maybe and extrapolate it too much. This is, Daniel Kahneman talks about this in his, book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, about saliency bias. Do not extrapolate from the last observation. Look at the trend that is there. And I think that's where I would wait and watch. I actually am not convinced that what you are seeing on savings in the last 1 year is something that will actually extrapolate, because what we've lived through in the last year is extraordinary times, outlier effects actually, which is not what is, on average what you're likely to see. So I think, these are two important things. I am quite much more optimistic about the savings actually, increasing because of the pro-cyclicality, and much less convinced that what has happened in the last 1 year will repeat itself going forward. I think, just to summarize once again, the main idea I've talked about is the vision for economic development in India, given the stage of development, a tripod with 3 legs to it, growth plus efficient welfare, ethical wealth creation, virtuous cycle, as basically the 3 legs of that tripod for the economic vision. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions. And once again, thanks a lot for inviting me.